Joined right now by a member of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Representative Jim Himes from Connecticut. He says Edward Snowden committed a crime and should be tried and charged as such. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Good to be here with you, Trish.
So what do you know as the latest right now on his whereabouts?
Well, I don't know more than any other official knows. Look, there's indications that he's perhaps still in Russia. We know he's made application to the Ecuadorians for asylum. So I don't know. And look, the bottom line, you know, he's not going to remain hidden for long. Eventually he'll turn up somewhere. And what he really needs to do is, if he believes that he's this sort of civil disobedient individual, you know, there is a long tradition of civil disobedience in the world, but it also, civil disobedience means you break the law and then you agree to abide by the consequences of that. And look, as far as I'm concerned, the more time he spends in places like Moscow and Hong Kong, the less he does for his own credibility.
Well, that's a very good point, you know, because right now, a lot of people have been pretty divided as to whether they think he's a traitor or a patriot. In fact, some of the initial polling immediately after this happened had a lot of Americans thinking that he had done the right things. So the more he's associated with the likes of China, Russia, the leftist parts of Latin America, then the more he's doing, would you say, to hurt himself in his home country?
Well, again, if you want stature as, and look, I happen to believe that, in fact, I know that he broke the law, and it's quite possible that he has put our national security in very serious jeopardy. Who knows what he shared with the Chinese? Maybe he doesn't even know what he shared with the Chinese or with the Russians or whatnot. So we have a situation here where a young guy, you know, made a decision, probably without consulting people with a little bit more world experience than he has, and has at a minimum, you know, put our national security at risk. Now, you can say that he sort of started an important national conversation, and there's a lot of people who believe that. But again, in the tradition of civil disobedience, if you're a Martin Luther King, or if that's who your role model is, or a Mohandas Gandhi, you break the law and then you willingly accept the consequences. Running around the globe, you know, trying to flee to regimes that are not necessarily friendly to the United States really does damage whatever standing he might have in the eyes of those who say that he's some, you know, morally upstanding individual.
Congressman Himes, what is it going to mean for our relations with the country that eventually decides to allow him to stay, to harbor him?
Well, you know, obviously it's going to be an irritant. And, you know, yes, it's not going to be helpful to U.S.-Chinese relations that they obviously let him out of Hong Kong. Of course, the bottom line is that we have such shared interests with China, such as North Korea, such as Iran, such as, you know, 10 other really crucial things I could name, is that, you know, it's not going to ultimately dramatically change relationships with China or with Russia. But look, you know, a country like Ecuador or China or Russia needs to decide whether they will abide by treaty obligations and by the rule of law. And of course, when you're talking about China and Russia, that's very much an open question.
Well, it's more complicated, isn't it, with China or Russia? And might they be less willing to help him because they realize how complicated it is, whereas a country like Ecuador maybe doesn't have as much at stake?
Yeah, look, and, you know, as you probably know, I was very aggressive with General Alexander in asking about the nature of these programs. I'm very concerned about the expanding surveillance state and whatnot. You know, but the bottom line is you can't run a country, you can't have a situation where every 29-year-old who is disaffected with what they see working for Booz Allen or working for the NSA decides to take it upon themselves to break the law and expose state secrets. That's obviously, you can't run a country that way. So look, I'm sympathetic to those, and in fact, I think in Congress I've been more aggressive than most on asking where we draw the lines on the protection of our civil liberties and our privacy. But, you know, Snowden, if he's going to retain any sort of ability to say what I'm doing here is civilly disobedient, first of all, he ought to ask himself, well, what would have happened in China or in Russia had the tables been turned and he'd done this to the Chinese or the Russians. But really what he's got to do is turn himself in and be willing to accept the consequences of his actions.
Yeah, effectively you're saying what you did was illegal and you need to pay the price. But back to this issue of security versus privacy, where do you draw the line, Congressman?
Well, you know, I've spent a lot of time on this in committee talking to General Alexander and to FBI people and whatnot. And, you know, one of the frightening things about where we find ourselves, particularly with this, you know, the exposure on Verizon and gathering the metadata on our phone calls, is that, you know, if you dig into it, it was actually not illegal under the Patriot Act, which, by the way, I voted against twice, or under Supreme Court decisions. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, where do we draw the line? Okay, so maybe you're comfortable with the NSA keeping metadata, those phone numbers. But what about video? You know, I don't see why, for example, under all of these statutes, they couldn't collect all the video of you or me walking around all day long. You know, I do think it is time for Congress to draw some very bright lines around where the national security establishment can and cannot go that take into account our legitimate rights to privacy.
All right, Congressman Jim Hines, thank you so much for joining us here today, Democrat from Connecticut.